The West's shifting view of Africa. A story of misunderstanding and change. For centuries, Africa has been misunderstood. The West once saw it as a land of mystery and wealth, then as a continent in need of saving. Wars, poverty, and famine dominated the headlines while Africa's achievements were ignored. But today, that narrative is changing. Africa is rising, and the world is finally paying attention. This is the story of how the West's view of Africa has shifted over time, why it matters now more than ever. Africa is a continent of 1.4 billion people, 54 countries, and over 3,000 ethnic groups. It has the youngest population in the world, a fast-growing economy, and a rich cultural legacy. Yet, for much of history, the Western world has misunderstood Africa, reducing it to a single story of hardship. This is not just about perception. How the world views Africa affects trade, investment, diplomacy, and even how Africans see themselves. So, how did we get here? And what's changing now? To understand the West's shifting view of Africa, we must go back in time. The colonial narrative. Africa as the dark continent. For centuries, Africa was seen as a land of wealth and mystery by Western explorers. From gold and ivory to the powerful kingdoms of Mali and Great Zimbabwe, Africa was rich. But in the 15th and 16th centuries, this perception shifted. Africa became a land to be exploited, not admired. Key events that shaped the narrative. The transatlantic slave trade, 1500s, 1800s. Millions of Africans were taken as slaves, fueling Western economies. The scramble for Africa, 1880s, 1900s. European countries divided Africa among themselves at the Berlin Conference, 1884 to 85. Colonial rule. Africa was controlled by European powers who suppressed its history and cultures. During this time, Africa was dehumanized in Western stories. European writers and scholars described it as the Dark Continent, a place of primitive tribes, wild animals, and endless jungle. Literature and media reinforced these ideas. Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, 1899, portrayed Africa as a savage land. Adventure stories like Tarzan showed Africa as a place of wild animals and uncivilized people. Western museums displayed African artifacts without context, treating African cultures as primitive. This was not an accident. By portraying Africa as backward, colonial rulers justified their exploitation. They told the world that Africa needed Western rule to be civilized. But behind the scenes, Africa was thriving with kingdoms, trade networks, and innovations that the West refused to acknowledge. Independence and the struggle for a new image, 1950s, 1990s. In the mid-20th century, Africa began to fight back. One by one, African nations gained independence from European rule. From Ghana in 1957 to South Africa's end of apartheid in 1994, a new Africa was emerging. Key moments in Africa's liberation. Kwame Nkrumah led Ghana to independence, 1957, marking the start of decolonization. Patrice Lumumba's leadership in Congo, 1960, a symbol of African nationalism, though he was later assassinated. Nelson Mandela's release from prison, 1990, ending decades of racial oppression in South Africa. Despite these victories, Western media continued to focus on Africa's struggles rather than its successes. How the West covered Africa in the 20th century. The Biafra War, 1967 to 1970. Africa was portrayed as war-torn, with images of starving children dominating the news. The Ethiopian famine, 1983-1985. Western charities like Live Aid helped, but the media focused only on suffering. The HIV/AIDS crisis, 1980s, 1990s. Africa was seen as helpless, rather than as a continent fighting for solutions. During this time, many Africans rejected the Western narrative. Writers, musicians, and leaders began reshaping Africa's image. Fela Kuti, Miriam Makeba, and Bob Marley used music to tell Africa's true story. Chinua Achebe's novel, Things Fall Apart, challenged Western views of African culture. New African media outlets began reporting Africa's progress, pushing back against negative portrayals. But still, the Western world saw Africa mainly as a place of conflict and crisis. The rise of a new Africa 2000s present. Something changed in the 21st century. Africa's image in the West began to shift from a continent of problems to a continent of opportunities. What sparked the change? Economic growth. Africa is home to 6 of the world's fastest growing economies. Technology, boom. African startups are thriving, with Nairobi called the Silicon Savannah. Cultural power, Afrobeats, Nollywood, and African fashion are now global. China's investment. China became Africa's largest trading partner, shifting Western interest in African markets. How the West now sees Africa. Africa Rising Narrative 2010s. Major publications like Time and The Economist started reporting on Africa's success. Tech and innovation. Companies like Flutterwave, Jumia, and Safaricom put Africa on the global tech map. Sports and entertainment. African athletes, musicians, and filmmakers are dominating global industries. Instead of just poverty and war, Western media now highlights entrepreneurs like Aliko Dangote, Africa's richest man, artists like Burna Boy and Wizkid winning global awards. Achievements are often overshadowed by negative news. However, the difference today is that Africans are reclaiming their narrative. Through social media, business, and culture, Africa is showing the world its true potential.
A monster in the sense that, like what I keep telling people, if I knew how difficult it was sort of putting this kind of, edifice, this kind of refinery, I wouldn't have started at all. But but by the time we realized that it was a very difficult thing, we had already started, so we had no choice than to deliver. That is not really only the hardest part. The hardest part, Francine, is delivering the project on its own. We never ever expected the kind of challenges that we face. We launched the project in 2013, and then we had a lot of problems with the state governments. It's not the federal government, because we have 3 tiers of government. So while we bought a land, it was in a state not far away from Lagos, and the guy dribbled us for almost about 3.5 years. And we had to now move the refinery to Lagos. We got to Lagos, we had community issues. So it took us really 5 years to start. Just battling here and there, after we had already taken loans of about 2.4 billion to start, and interest was counting. But then still, we went ahead. Then again, the challenges of building that kind of, project, we realized that, we had to build our own port. We built the port. After building the port, we realized that nobody could supply us with cranes, equipment. So we had to take something that people don't know or they don't realize. What we did now, we now made ourselves as the EPC contractor, which is engineering, procurement, and construction. So we did it on our own. And because we have never, ever handled this kind of project, this kind of project are handled by Saipem, by Bechtel, the big guys. But we took that challenge. And that is why people believe that, no, it will never work.